Long shadows stretched across the quiet street as 98-year-old Eleanor Davis leaned heavily on the scratched metal frame of a weathered payphone. Her frail hands, marked with the passage of time, fumbled slightly as she slid a coin into the slot. With one hand gripping the receiver, she steadied herself against the plastic phone box with the other. Despite her age, there was a sense of urgency in her movements, a quiet determination in her tired eyes. Her whisper barely broke through the hum of passing cars. "Please, pick up," she murmured, her voice a fragile thread of sound. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. Eleanor let out a weary sigh, her shoulders sagging slightly. Yet she refused to give up. Fishing another quarter from her purse, she prepared to try again. The quiet clink of the coin dropping into the machine echoed faintly in the stillness of the evening. Across the street, Officer Michael Vance sat in his patrol car, his attention caught by the scene. He had been watching the elderly woman for nearly half an hour. A quiet evening in the suburban neighborhood meant little action, and Eleanor's persistence at the payphone stood out. Michael tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, debating. Loitering was loitering, no matter one's age, but there was something about her that kept him glued to the scene. She wasn't causing any trouble, but her determination felt unusual. His radio crackled to life, pulling him from his thoughts. "Unit 247, what's your status?" He picked up the receiver. "This is 247, observing a possible loitering incident on Elmwood and 8th, elderly individual at the phone booth." "Copy that. Keep us updated." Michael glanced back at Eleanor. She made another quiet plea into the phone, her lips moving soundlessly. Shaking his head, he opened the car door and stepped out. As he approached, the setting sun highlighted the streaks of silver in Eleanor's hair, casting a soft halo around her fragile frame. "Ma'am," he began gently, "is everything all right?" Eleanor turned slowly, her sharp eyes meeting his. Though her posture was frail, her gaze was steady and piercing. "Officer, I'm fine, but I need to finish this call. It's important." Michael hesitated. "You've been here a while. Is there someone I can help you contact?" She gave him a tight smile. "That's very kind of you, but this is something I must do myself." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "I understand, ma'am, but you can't stay here much longer. People aren't allowed to loiter at public phone booths even if—" He trailed off, catching himself. Eleanor's voice didn't rise, but there was steel in her tone. "I understand the rules, officer, but I am not finished." She turned back to the phone, her hand already fishing for another quarter. Michael stepped closer, his voice firmer now. "Ma'am, I'll have to ask you to leave. If you don't, I'm afraid I'll need to escort you downtown." Eleanor paused, her fingers resting on the payphone's keypad. She turned to face him again, her sharp eyes locking onto his. "You'll regret this," she said softly. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement, calm and assured. A chill ran down Michael's spine. He ignored it, reminding himself of his duty. With a sigh, he pulled out his handcuffs. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice tinged with reluctance. Eleanor didn't resist. She placed the receiver back on its cradle and held out her thin, spotted wrists. The cuffs clicked around them, loose enough to avoid discomfort. As Michael helped her into the back of his squad car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Eleanor's face was calm, almost serene, as though she had expected this all along. The police station was brightly lit, the fluorescent lights casting harsh reflections on the cold, tiled floor. As Officer Michael Vance processed Eleanor Davis's paperwork, he couldn't help but glance toward the holding area where she sat. Through the glass partition, he saw her seated primly on the bench, her back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't look like a woman who had just been arrested. If anything, she seemed composed, almost regal, as though she were hosting a tea party rather than waiting for her fingerprinting. Her demeanor unsettled him. Most detainees, even the harmless ones, showed some form of distress, confusion, fear, or indignation. Eleanor displayed none of that. Michael tapped at the keyboard, inputting her information into the system. His fingers paused as he considered something. Slowly, he stood and walked to the glass wall. "Mrs. Davis," he said through the open door. "Can I get your date of birth?" Her voice was steady as she replied, "March 12th, 1925. Michael nodded and returned to his desk, making a note. Before he could sit down, the desk phone rang sharply, slicing through the quiet hum of the station. "Vance here," a clear, commanding voice answered on the other end. "This is James Davis. I believe you're holding my mother, Eleanor Davis, on a loitering charge." Michael froze. The name struck a chord. James Davis wasn't just any lawyer. He was the James Davis, a formidable attorney with a reputation for being both ruthless and highly influential in the city. "Yes, sir," Michael stammered. "She was—" "Release her immediately," James interrupted. His tone brooked no argument. "The necessary paperwork will be on your captain's desk within the hour. I trust there won't be any complications." Michael swallowed hard. "No, sir, of course not." "Good," James said sharply. Then, after a pause, his voice softened slightly, but only to deliver a warning. "And Officer Vance? Ensure this doesn't happen again." The line clicked dead, leaving Michael standing motionless with the receiver still pressed to his ear. Slowly, he set it down and turned toward the holding area. Eleanor was watching him through the glass, her gaze sharp and unflinching. He walked back toward her, his footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. "Your son just called," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Yes," Eleanor replied simply, as though she'd known this would happen. "James has a way of getting what he wants, doesn't he?" Michael hesitated. "What's going on here, Mrs. Davis? Why were you so insistent on making those phone calls tonight?" Eleanor met his eyes, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something behind her calm exterior, an emotion he couldn't quite place. "Listen to me carefully, Officer Vance," she said, her voice low and steady, "before it's too late." Before Michael could respond, Eleanor's face contorted in pain. She gasped and clutched her chest, her frail body curling inward as she slid off the bench onto the floor. "Mrs. Davis!" Michael shouted, rushing toward her. He knelt by her side, his hand fumbling for his radio. "We need an ambulance, now!" The ambulance raced through the quiet streets, its siren wailing and lights flashing. Inside, Michael sat beside Eleanor's stretcher, his heart pounding with guilt and worry. The paramedics worked methodically, adjusting her oxygen mask and checking her vitals. "She's stabilizing," one of them murmured to their partner, though their tone was cautious. Michael leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He watched Eleanor's chest rise and fall, the movement shallow but steady. Her face was pale, her frailty more apparent than ever under the harsh fluorescent lights of the ambulance. Suddenly, her eyes fluttered open. She scanned the small space until her gaze landed on Michael. With a trembling hand, she reached up and pulled the oxygen mask away from her face. "Ma'am, you need to keep that on," one of the paramedics said firmly. But Eleanor ignored him, her focus fixed entirely on Michael. "I know your father's secret," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ambulance engine. Michael's breath caught. "What?" Her eyes bored into his, sharp and unyielding despite her weakened state. "He asked me to tell you, before it's too late." The paramedic gently but firmly replaced the oxygen mask, blocking any further conversation. "She needs rest," they said, shooting Michael a pointed look. Michael leaned back, his mind racing. His father, Judge Marcus Vance, was known as one of the most principled and respected figures in the state. What kind of secret could Eleanor Davis possibly know? As the ambulance pulled into the hospital driveway, Michael's thoughts were a storm of confusion and dread. He watched as the paramedics wheeled Eleanor inside, her small frame disappearing through the automatic doors. Whatever she had tried to tell him, it was clear that tonight's events were only the beginning of something far bigger and far more troubling than he could have anticipated. The waiting room lights of the hospital cast a cold, clinical glow on Michael as he paced the length of the room. His thoughts churned relentlessly, each step echoing his frustration. Nurses and doctors moved purposefully around him, their efficiency a stark contrast to the storm brewing in his mind. He checked his watch. Again. Only 5 minutes had passed since the last time he looked, though it felt like an eternity. The soft whoosh of the automatic doors broke his pacing. A tall man in an impeccably tailored suit strode in, his shoes clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Michael didn't need an introduction to know who it was. James Davis. James's expression was a masterclass in controlled anger, his jaw tight and his gaze piercing. "Officer Vance," he said evenly, his voice measured but icy. "I trust you have a very compelling explanation for why my 98-year-old mother was arrested tonight." Michael straightened instinctively, his training kicking in. "Mr. Davis, your mother was—" "Don't," James interrupted, raising a hand. "Don't even try to justify it. You arrested her for using a payphone. A payphone, officer. She's almost 100 years old. What possible threat could she pose?" Michael shifted uncomfortably. "I was following protocol, sir." "Protocol?" James's voice sharpened, drawing the attention of a nearby nurse. He took a deliberate step closer. "Let me tell you what's not protocol. Cuffing an elderly woman in the middle of the street. Do you have any idea who my mother is, what she's been through?" Before Michael could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Her voice was calm, but insistent. "Mr. Davis, Mrs. Davis is asking for Officer Vance." James's expression darkened. "She's asking for him?" "Yes," the nurse replied firmly. "She's been very clear about that." James clenched his jaw, his carefully constructed composure faltering. After a moment, he waved Michael off dismissively. "Fine," he said curtly, "but this isn't over, officer. Not by a long shot." Michael followed the nurse down the quiet hallway, his footsteps muffled against the polished floors. When they reached Eleanor's room, the nurse gestured for him to enter. Eleanor was propped up against her pillows, her frail body dwarfed by the sterile expanse of the hospital bed. Despite her evident exhaustion, her eyes were sharp and alert. She motioned for Michael to sit in the chair beside her. "You came," she said softly, her voice steady despite her weakened state. Michael sat down, leaning forward slightly. "You asked for me. Why?" Eleanor studied him for a moment before speaking. "Your father was a man of many layers, Officer Vance. Publicly, he was a paragon of virtue. Privately, he made choices he believed were for the greater good, but choices that came at a cost." Michael felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "What are you saying?" She folded her hands in her lap, her gaze unwavering. "Years ago, there was a family in this city. Powerful, wealthy. The Hendersons. They owned nearly everything that mattered. Factories, land, influence. But their fortune wasn't built honestly. Fraud, embezzlement, blackmail. It was all there." Michael frowned. "What does this have to do with my father?" Eleanor's expression softened, tinged with sadness. "He was assigned to a case involving the Hendersons. The evidence was damning. If it had been made public, it would have ruined them and devastated the city's economy. Thousands of jobs would have been lost. Businesses would have crumbled. Families would have been destroyed." Michael's heart pounded as he listened. "Your father," Eleanor continued, "chose to bury the evidence. To protect the city," he said. "But it wasn't just about the city." She hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. "He was protecting you too." "Me?" Michael's voice was barely above a whisper. "The Hendersons were ruthless," Eleanor said. "Your father knew that if he exposed them, they would retaliate. You were just a boy at the time. He sent you to live with your aunt to keep you safe. But make no mistake, Officer Vance, he paid for that protection. He carried the weight of that decision for the rest of his life." Michael leaned back, his mind reeling. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because the truth has a way of surfacing," Eleanor said, her voice firm despite her frailty. "And when it does, you need to be ready to face it." Before Michael could respond, Eleanor's breath hitched. She pressed a hand to her chest, her face contorting in pain. "Nurse!" Michael called, leaping to his feet. As medical staff rushed into the room, Michael stepped back, his thoughts racing. The secrets Eleanor had revealed were like cracks in the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his father. But one question loomed larger than all the others. What would he do with the truth? Michael sat in his car outside the hospital, the dashboard lights casting faint shadows across his face. Eleanor's words repeated in his mind like a haunting melody, unraveling everything he thought he knew about his father. His hands gripped the steering wheel, the cool leather grounding him in the present. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his notepad, flipping to the page where he had written down the address Eleanor had given him. 417 Maple Street. Her voice echoed in his head. Under the floorboards of my old bedroom. The northeast corner. The neighborhood wasn't far, an older section of town, long past its prime but still standing as a quiet reminder of better days. Michael started the car, the engine's hum breaking the stillness of the night. The house at 417 Maple Street was as Eleanor had described, weathered and worn, its once pristine siding faded to a dull gray. A crooked for sale sign leaned in the overgrown front yard, its paint peeling from years of neglect. Michael parked on the curb and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel driveway. The faint scent of mildew greeted him as he approached the front door. The lock turned easily, the real estate agent having provided a temporary key after some persuasion about an ongoing investigation. The interior of the house was eerily silent, the air stale and thick with dust. Pale moonlight filtered through tattered curtains, casting uneven shadows on the cracked hardwood floors. Michael's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, guiding him as he climbed the creaking staircase to the second floor. Eleanor's instructions were clear. My old bedroom. Northeast corner. Michael pushed open the door to the room, the hinges groaning in protest. The space was empty save for a few cobwebs clinging to the corners. He scanned the floor, his eyes landing on a patch of wood that seemed darker than the rest. A single board, slightly warped with time. Kneeling, Michael ran his fingers along the edges of the plank. It gave way with a light tug, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. His breath caught as he pulled out a tin box, its surface rusted but intact. The box was heavier than he expected. He sat back on his heels, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside, wrapped carefully in a worn piece of cloth, was a leather-bound ledger. Its edges were frayed, the cover cracked with age, but the contents were meticulously preserved. Michael flipped through the pages, his flashlight illuminating rows of handwritten entries. Each page was a carefully documented account of meetings, decisions, and secrets. Names, dates, amounts, everything was recorded in Eleanor's neat, deliberate handwriting. One entry caught his attention. June 14th, 1985. Samuel made his choice today. He buried the truth to protect the city, but also to protect his son. The Hendersons have agreed to leave Eric untouched, provided we comply. My heart aches for the price we've paid, but I cannot blame him. He is a father above all else. Michael's pulse quickened. Eric untouched. That meant him. His father had made a deal not just to shield the city, but to safeguard him personally. The full weight of the ledger's implications began to sink in. The next entry deepened the mystery. July 5th, 1985. The Hendersons have demanded a written guarantee. Samuel is hesitant, but sees no other way. This is the moment that will haunt us both. I've kept a copy of the agreement under the oak tree. If ever the truth must be known, it lies there. Michael frowned. The oak tree? He flipped back to earlier pages, finding repeated references to the same tree. It was a meeting place, a safe spot where sensitive documents were hidden. His flashlight's beam lingered on the page as he read the words again. Eleanor hadn't just chronicled the past. She had hidden key evidence that could expose everything. Michael returned to the hospital, the ledger tucked securely in his bag. As he stepped into Eleanor's room, he found her resting, her frail frame illuminated by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her eyes opening as he approached. "You found it," she said, her voice weak but certain. Michael nodded, pulling the ledger from his bag. "It's all here. Everything you documented." Eleanor's gaze lingered on the book, a mixture of relief and sorrow flickering in her eyes. "I kept it safe," she whispered. "For decades, I kept it safe." "There's something else," Michael said. "You wrote about the oak tree. What's hidden there?" A faint smile touched her lips. The last piece of the puzzle. A copy of the agreement Samuel signed. It's buried near the oak tree at Crescent Grove Cemetery. That's where we met. That's where it all began. Michael's heart sank. The cemetery was a sprawling, overgrown property on the edge of town. Finding one tree among hundreds would be no small feat. "I'll find it," he said firmly. Eleanor's eyes closed briefly, her voice barely a whisper. "Be careful, Officer Vance. There are those who would rather the past stay buried." Michael left the hospital with the weight of Eleanor's words pressing on him like a tangible force. The night air was heavy, and the faint chirping of crickets was the only sound as he walked to his car. The streets were quiet, but his mind was anything but. The ledger sat securely on the passenger seat, a silent testament to the secrets it held. Crescent Grove Cemetery wasn't far, but its reputation made him uneasy. The cemetery sprawled over acres of uneven ground, its paths winding between ancient headstones and gnarled trees that stood like sentinels in the dark. Crescent Grove was old, one of the oldest burial sites in the city, and it carried an air of solemnity that bordered on eerie. The moon cast a pale light over the landscape, and shadows danced between the gravestones as Michael stepped through the rusted gates. He clutched a small flashlight in one hand, its beam piercing the darkness in front of him. The oak tree Eleanor had mentioned would be somewhere deeper inside. The cemetery wasn't well maintained, and the paths were overgrown with grass and tangled roots. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Michael scanned the area, his flashlight flickering over headstones and crumbling mausoleums. There were several oaks scattered throughout the grounds, their massive branches stretching out like skeletal arms. He moved carefully, his boots crunching on loose gravel and twigs, searching for any sign that might guide him to the right spot. It took nearly an hour before he found it. The tree stood at the edge of a clearing, its twisted roots pushing up through the ground like veins. Unlike the others, this oak bore a peculiar marker, a weathered stone slab resting against its base. The slab was engraved with initials, S.V. and E.D. Michael felt a chill run through him. Samuel Vance and Eleanor Davis. This had to be the place. He crouched near the base of the tree, running his hands over the uneven ground. The dirt was soft, loose in places, as if it had been disturbed before. Using a small trowel he'd brought from his car, he began to dig carefully, the damp soil giving way with each movement. After several minutes, his trowel hit something solid. He paused, his breath hitching as he cleared the dirt away to reveal a small metal box, its surface tarnished but intact. He pulled it free, wiping the soil from its lid. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single envelope, its paper yellowed with age but sealed with wax. The wax bore the impression of an ornate crest, the Henderson family seal. Michael stared at it, the significance sinking in. This was the agreement Eleanor had written about, the document his father had signed all those years ago. He carefully removed the envelope, holding it under his flashlight's beam. The words inside were brief but damning. It outlined the terms of the deal Samuel had made with the Hendersons, the suppression of evidence, the promise of protection for their family in exchange for economic stability, and the unspoken assurance that Samuel's son would remain safe. Michael's stomach turned as he read. His father's name, bold and unmistakable, was at the bottom of the page, alongside the signatures of the Henderson patriarch and Eleanor Davis. It was all true. Every word Eleanor had spoken, every entry in her ledger, it was all there in black and white. He folded the paper carefully and placed it back into the box. As he stood, the cemetery seemed quieter than before, as if the weight of what he'd uncovered had silenced even the wind. He felt exposed, vulnerable, standing in the open with something so dangerous in his possession. The drive home was tense. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though the roads were empty and his rearview mirror showed nothing but darkness. When he finally reached his apartment, he double-checked the locks on his door and placed the box and ledger in a secure drawer. Sitting at his kitchen table, he stared at his phone. He had the evidence to expose the truth, everything his father had hidden, everything Eleanor had sacrificed to protect. But the implications were staggering. If he went public, it wouldn't just tarnish his father's legacy. It would destroy the reputation of countless others, people who had built their lives on the stability that Deal had provided. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from his captain. "We need to talk. First thing in the morning. My office." Michael stared at the screen, a knot forming in his chest. The captain's tone was terse, the message ominous. Someone else knew, or at least suspected, what he was uncovering. Morning came far too quickly, the rising sun casting long streaks of light across his apartment. Michael dressed carefully, tucking the ledger into his bag alongside the envelope. If the meeting with his captain went south, he needed to be prepared. When he arrived at the precinct, the usual morning buzz seemed quieter than normal. Eyes followed him as he walked to the captain's office, whispers dying as he passed. He knocked on the door, the sound reverberating through the hallway. "Come in," a deep voice called. Captain Reed sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. He motioned for Michael to close the door and take a seat. "What's this about, sir?" Michael asked, keeping his tone steady. Reed leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Word travels fast in this town, Vance, faster than you'd think. And I hear you've been digging into some very old, very sensitive matters." Michael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Reed continued, his tone calm but laced with warning. "I'm going to give you a piece of advice. There are things in this city that are better left buried. You're not going to solve anything by dredging up the past. All you're going to do is ruin lives, yours included." Michael met his gaze evenly. "With respect, Captain, if what I've found is true, lives were ruined decades ago. People deserve the truth." Reed's expression hardened. "The truth, Vance?" "You think the truth is black and white. You've been a cop long enough to know better. Sometimes protecting people means making hard choices. Choices your father understood better than anyone." Michael's pulse quickened. "So you knew." Reed sighed, sitting back in his chair. "Everyone who's been here long enough knows. We all owe your father a debt. That man kept this city from imploding, and he paid a heavy price to do it." Michael shook his head. "That doesn't make it right." Reed's eyes narrowed. "Be careful, Vance. If you push this too far, you might not like what you find, and you might not like what it costs you." Michael stood, his resolve unwavering. "Some things are worth the cost, Captain." As he left the office, his mind was set. The truth would come out, no matter the consequences. Michael left the precinct, his captain's words echoing ominously in his mind. The warning was clear: stop digging or face the fallout. But it only solidified his resolve. The truth, no matter how messy or painful, deserved to be known. He couldn't let fear or pressure deter him now. Driving to his apartment, Michael considered his next steps. The ledger and the agreement provided undeniable proof of what had happened decades ago, but he needed to figure out how to handle this information. Publicizing it without caution could destroy lives, his father's, Eleanor's, even his own. Yet hiding it felt like complicity. As he unlocked his apartment door, his phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from an unknown number. "Meet me. Tonight. Crescent Grove Cemetery. Midnight. Come alone." Michael stared at the screen, his gut tightening with unease. He couldn't tell if it was a trap or another piece of the puzzle waiting to fall into place. Either way, he had no choice but to go. The cemetery was darker this time, the moon obscured by thick clouds that left the grounds shrouded in near-total blackness. Michael parked just outside the gates, his flashlight in hand and the ledger tucked securely in his jacket. He moved cautiously, the silence around him broken only by the crunch of gravel under his boots. In the distance, a faint beam of light flickered between the gravestones. Michael followed it, his steps slow and deliberate. As he approached the oak tree where he'd unearthed the agreement, a figure stepped into view. It was James Davis. "Officer Vance," James said, his voice low but sharp. His flashlight illuminated his face, the tightness in his jaw betraying his barely contained anger. "You've stirred up a lot of trouble." Michael stopped a few feet away, keeping his expression neutral. "You asked me to meet you." James shook his head. "Number, I'm here to stop you. Do you have any idea what you're doing? What you'll destroy if you go through with this?" Michael stood firm. "I'm uncovering the truth. The lives that were ruined. The families left broken. Those things matter. Your mother's story matters." James's eyes flashed. "My mother's obsession with the past has defined her entire life. I've spent decades cleaning up the messes she's left behind, and now you want to drag it all back into the light? For what? Justice?" "People deserve to know what happened," Michael said evenly. "This isn't just about your mother or my father. It's about a system that let powerful people escape accountability while others paid the price." James stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "Do you think exposing this will change anything? Do you think people will care about a scandal from 40 years ago? All you'll do is ruin the reputation of good men who made hard choices to protect this city." Michael's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe it won't change anything, but the truth matters, and I can't ignore it." James exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're just like her," he muttered, "chasing ghosts while the living pay the price." He turned to leave, his flashlight casting long shadows as he disappeared into the darkness. Michael stood there for a moment, the weight of James's words pressing down on him. But his resolve didn't falter. The truth was messy, complicated, and painful, but it was necessary. Back at his apartment, Michael spread the ledger and the agreement across his table. He began compiling the evidence, scanning pages and taking photos to ensure there was a digital record. He typed notes, summarizing key points and connecting the dots between the Hendersons, his father, and Eleanor. Hours passed, the quiet hum of his computer the only sound in the room. By the time the sun rose, Michael had pieced together a comprehensive account of the scandal, ready to share it with the world. As he prepared to hit send on an encrypted email to a trusted journalist, he paused. His finger hovered over the button, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. This wasn't just about the past. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be. A man who buried the truth for the sake of comfort, or one who faced the consequences head-on. With a deep breath, he pressed send. The fallout came quickly. Within days, the story broke, sending shockwaves through the city. Headlines splashed across newspapers and websites exposed the decades-old conspiracy, the names of those involved laid bare. The Henderson family's legacy crumbled, their wealth and influence no longer enough to shield them from scrutiny. Eleanor became a reluctant hero, her role in documenting the truth finally recognized. She passed peacefully in her sleep a week after the story broke, her name cleared, her legacy intact. Michael's father, Samuel, didn't speak to him for weeks. When they finally sat down together, the conversation was tense but honest. Samuel admitted to his choices, his justifications, and his regrets. For the first time, Michael saw his father not as a symbol of righteousness, but as a flawed, complex man who had tried to navigate an impossible situation. Months later, as Michael stood by Eleanor's grave, he felt a quiet sense of closure. The truth was out, and though it had caused pain and upheaval, it had also brought clarity and justice. He placed a single white rose on her headstone, the morning sun casting soft light over the cemetery. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. As he walked away, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Michael felt ready to face it. He had finished the story Eleanor had started, and in doing so, began his own. Eric ran his hand over the polished surface of his desk, the neatly stacked papers sitting off to the side. In front of him, Lena's journal rested as a silent witness to the choices and sacrifices she had documented. Weeks had passed since her last day in the hospital, and while her absence was deeply felt, her presence continued to shape his life and the community. The foundation was growing rapidly, but with that came new challenges. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Looking up, he saw David standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of determination and hesitation. "Do you have a minute?" David asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Eric nodded, motioning toward the chair in front of him. David sat carefully, placing a thin folder on the desk between them. "I've been thinking about all of this," David began, his eyes avoiding Eric's as he spoke. "Mom, the foundation, even the impact she had on my career." He paused, as though weighing each word. "I always thought I understood who she was, but I realize now I was wrong." Eric tilted his head slightly, silently encouraging him to continue. "I used to think her insistence on truth and helping others was an obstacle, something holding me back from my own success," David admitted, his voice laced with guilt. "But now I see it was the opposite. She wasn't holding me back. She was showing me what truly matters." David slid the folder across the desk. Eric opened it, finding within a detailed proposal to expand the foundation with a mentorship program for at-risk youth. "I want to help Eric, not just in her name, but because I finally understand what she was trying to teach us," David said, his voice steady but earnest. Eric's gaze lingered on the pages of the proposal. It was thorough, ambitious, and exactly the kind of initiative Lena would have championed. "This is good, David," Eric said finally, looking up. "She would be proud." David smiled faintly, the weight of years of misunderstanding starting to lift. "Let's make this happen," Eric added, and for the first time, David felt like he was truly honoring his mother's legacy. The mentorship program took shape quickly, with both Eric and David working tirelessly to bring Lena's vision to life. Within weeks, they partnered with local schools, community leaders, and businesses to provide resources, workshops, and one-on-one guidance for young people in need. At the first mentorship meeting, Eric stood at the front of the room addressing a group of 20 teens who had signed up. Lena Crawford believed in second chances, he began, holding up her journal. She believed in the power of education and kindness to transform lives. This program is built on those same principles. The room was quiet as Eric shared snippets of Lena's story, how she had sacrificed her career, her reputation, and even her relationships to do what was right. One of the teens raised her hand. "Do you think we can make a difference like she did?" she asked, her voice tentative. Eric smiled, thinking of Lena's words. "Every small act of courage creates ripples." "I know you can," he said. "And this program is here to help you start." David, standing at the back of the room, watched as the teens began to open up, sharing their struggles and dreams. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that his mother's sacrifices were not in vain, and that her legacy would continue to inspire change. The following week, Eric visited the precinct's Community Outreach Center. The room was buzzing with activity as officers worked with volunteers to prepare for an upcoming event. Captain Reed approached, his expression unreadable. "Vance," he said gruffly, crossing his arms. "Word is the mentorship program's already making waves, that Thompson kid from last month. He's doing well at that new job you helped him get." Eric nodded, keeping his response humble. "It's a start." Reed's stern expression softened slightly. "A good one," he admitted. As the captain walked away, Eric glanced at a bulletin board displaying photos from recent community events. At the center was a picture of Lena, her warm smile radiating the quiet strength that had changed so many lives. Eric felt a deep sense of gratitude. Lena's legacy wasn't just in the programs or the scholarships. It was in the way people were choosing to live, inspired by her example. And as he left the center that evening, the cool night air wrapped around him like a silent promise. Her story would never be forgotten. Later that night, Eric sat in his living room, the dim light of a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. On the coffee table in front of him lay Lena's journal, now joined by a collection of notes and documents outlining the progress of the mentorship program and other initiatives. The foundation had sparked something larger than he'd imagined, but it also brought questions, ones he still wrestled with. Picking up a pen, Eric opened a blank notebook and began writing. "Sometimes we are left with more questions than answers," he wrote, his pen moving steadily across the page. Lena's choices were brave, but they also came at a great cost. My father's decisions protected many, but compromised his own sense of justice. Both paths left scars, and yet, both paths mattered. As he continued to write, the words came more easily, as though Lena's spirit guided him. He wasn't writing for anyone else this time, just for himself. At the foundation office the next morning, Eric found David already at work. His brother sat at a desk littered with documents, his tie loosened and his jacket draped over the back of his chair. "You're here early," Eric remarked, setting down a cup of coffee on the desk. David chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "Can't sleep. Too much on my mind." Eric pulled up a chair. "What's bothering you?" David hesitated, tapping a pen against the desk. "It's the weight of it all. Knowing Mom gave up so much and now we're carrying it forward. I want to do it justice, but sometimes I wonder if we're enough." Eric placed a reassuring hand on his brother's shoulder. "Lena didn't expect us to be perfect, David. She just wanted us to try. And look at what's already happening, kids getting opportunities, families finding hope. That's because of her and because of you." David nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "You're right. It's not about being perfect. It's about moving forward." The foundation's next big event was a fundraiser, and the community rallied behind it. The room was packed with people whose lives had been touched by Lena's work or the programs inspired by her. Samuel, seated in the front row, looked more relaxed than Eric had seen him in years. His health had improved, and he seemed lighter, freer, as though the truth had finally unburdened him. When it was Eric's turn to speak, he stepped up to the podium and paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "Lena Crawford taught me that the most powerful change often starts small," he began. "She believed in the ripple effect, how one act of kindness, one moment of bravery, can create waves that touch countless lives." He shared stories from the mentorship program, highlighting the teens who had found their footing thanks to Lena's legacy. He spoke of the police department's new outreach efforts and how they were transforming relationships between officers and the community. And none of this would be possible without her, Eric concluded, his voice thick with emotion. "She was our light, and it's up to us to carry that light forward." The room erupted in applause, and as Eric stepped away from the podium, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Lena's story was alive, not just in words but in action, and her sacrifices were yielding fruit. The fundraiser wrapped up well into the evening, the energy in the room still buzzing with hope and purpose. Eric found himself standing near a display of photographs, including one of Lena teaching a group of children. Her expression was one of pure joy, her hands gesturing animatedly as if bringing her lesson to life. David approached him, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. "You did well up there," he said, handing Eric a glass. "Thanks," Eric replied, his eyes lingering on the photo. "I just hope we're doing her justice." David sipped his drink thoughtfully. "You know, I spent so many years trying to distance myself from her legacy, convinced it wasn't worth the sacrifice. Now, standing here, seeing all these people, I finally get it. She wasn't just holding on to the past. She was building a future." Eric nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "It took me a while to see it too, but she always saw it, even when no one else did." The following week, Eric received an unexpected invitation. Samuel had asked him to come over for dinner, a rare occurrence since the truth about the Henderson case had come to light. When Eric arrived, he found his father in the study, poring over a stack of old files. "Dinner's almost ready," Samuel said, glancing up. "But there's something I wanted to show you first." Eric stepped closer as Samuel opened a folder and handed him a faded letter. The handwriting was familiar. It was Lena's. "It's a letter she wrote to me after everything happened," Samuel said quietly. "I found it while going through some old files." Eric read the letter, his father's voice breaking the silence as he did. "Samuel, we may never fully agree on the choices we've made, but I want you to know I understand why you made yours. It's not an easy thing, carrying the weight of an entire community on your shoulders. But I hope one day you'll see that the truth doesn't have to be an enemy. It can be a bridge, a way forward. When the time comes, I hope you'll find the courage to walk across it. Lena." Eric looked up, his throat tight. "She still believed in you," he said. Samuel nodded, his expression solemn. "She did. And for a long time I didn't deserve it, but I want to now." In the months that followed, the foundation continued to grow. The scholarships expanded to include mentorships, career training, and even community service projects. David spearheaded a program to provide free legal aid to underprivileged families, using his skills to honor Lena's commitment to justice. Eric's work as a police officer took on a new dimension. He started hosting workshops on restorative justice, helping fellow officers understand the importance of empathy and community connection. Captain Reed, once skeptical, became an advocate for the changes, praising Eric's efforts during precinct meetings. Samuel, meanwhile, began speaking at law schools, sharing his experiences and emphasizing the importance of integrity and leadership. His talks often featured stories about Lena, and he never failed to credit her with inspiring him to reflect on his choices. One crisp autumn afternoon, Eric returned to the cemetery. He carried a small wooden plaque engraved with the words, "In memory of Lena Crawford, a life lived with courage, truth, and compassion. Her light continues to guide us." He knelt by her grave, securing the plaque into the ground beside her headstone. The wildflowers he'd placed during his last visit had dried, but their beauty lingered, a reminder of Lena's enduring impact. As he stood, a breeze rustled the leaves around him, carrying with it a sense of peace. "Thank you, Lena," Eric whispered, "for everything." Eric left the cemetery with a lighter heart, but a sharper sense of purpose. As he drove back into the city, the late afternoon sun painted the skyline in hues of orange and gold. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a message from David. "Lunch tomorrow? I want to run an idea by you." Eric smiled. It had become a habit for the brothers to meet regularly, often brainstorming ways to expand the foundation's reach or reflecting on the profound ripple effects of Lena's legacy. He responded quickly, "Count me in." The next day, they met at a small cafe near the courthouse. David was already seated, a stack of papers beside his coffee. His tie was loosened, a rare sign of his increasingly relaxed demeanor. "Glad you could make it," David said, pushing a folder across the table. Eric opened it, his brows lifting as he scanned the contents. The proposal outlined a new initiative for the foundation, a restorative justice program that would partner with local schools to mentor at-risk youth. "We're calling it the Lena Initiative," David explained. "It's about giving kids a chance to rewrite their stories before they get pulled into the system. It would involve police officers, community leaders, and even former offenders who've turned their lives around." Eric leaned back, nodding slowly. "This is good, David. It feels like the next step." David's smile was faint but genuine. It's Mom's step. She always believed in second chances. The program launched months later, starting small but quickly gaining traction. Eric became a mentor to several teens, sharing his experiences and guiding them toward paths of self-discovery and accountability. The precinct's involvement grew as more officers volunteered their time, inspired by Eric's approach. One of Eric's mentees, a boy named Jamal, reminded him of Marcus Thompson, the young man he had helped earlier. Jamal had been caught shoplifting but was now thriving under the program, excelling in school and even leading a community project to revitalize a local park. "Why do you help me?" Jamal asked one day as they worked side by side planting flowers in the park's garden. Eric paused, wiping sweat from his brow. Because someone once taught me that everyone deserves a chance to grow, no matter where they start. Jamal nodded thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on the blooming flowers. I'm going to make you proud, Officer Vance. You already have, Eric replied. Meanwhile, Samuel faced his own challenges. His talks at universities and legal forums brought him into the spotlight, reopening old wounds and attracting both praise and criticism. During one particularly tense Q&A session at a law school, a student asked, "Judge Vance, do you regret your decisions?" Samuel paused, gripping the podium. He looked out at the sea of young faces, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "I regret the harm those decisions caused," he said slowly. "But I don't regret the lessons they've taught me. If I can use those lessons to help others avoid my mistakes, then perhaps some good can come from them." The room fell silent before breaking into applause. Later, as Samuel left the lecture hall, he felt a weight lift. Acknowledgement and accountability were becoming his path to redemption. On the anniversary of Lena's passing, the foundation hosted a community event. Families gathered in a park dedicated to her memory, enjoying live music, food stalls, and activities for children. A large mural was unveiled, depicting Lena in a field of wildflowers, her face serene and her eyes full of wisdom. Eric stood with his family, his heart swelling with pride as the crowd admired the artwork. "She would have loved this," David said quietly. Eric nodded. She would have loved knowing her story is still inspiring people. As the sun set and the crowd began to disperse, Eric lingered by the mural. He traced his fingers along the painted wildflowers, his thoughts drifting to the moments he'd shared with Lena. A voice interrupted his reverie. "Beautiful, isn't it?" He turned to see a young woman, her hands clutching a small notebook. "I'm Sarah Chen," she said, smiling nervously. "The first scholarship recipient." Eric shook her hand. "I remember you from the launch event. How's teaching?" "It's everything I hoped it would be," Sarah replied. She hesitated before holding out the notebook. "I thought you might want this. It's my journal from my first year of teaching. I wrote a lot about Mrs. Crawford and how her story inspired me." Eric accepted the notebook, his throat tightening. "Thank you, Sarah. This means a lot." "She meant a lot," Sarah said, glancing at the mural. "She taught me that even small acts of kindness can change lives." As Sarah walked away, Eric opened the notebook. The first entry read, "Mrs. Crawford taught me to believe in myself when no one else did. I want to be that person for my students." Eric smiled, tucking the journal under his arm. Lena's legacy was alive and thriving, woven into the lives of those she had touched and those who continued to be inspired by her courage. As the stars emerged in the twilight sky, Eric made a silent vow to carry her light forward, ensuring that her story, and the values she embodied, would never fade. Months after the community event, the Lena Initiative expanded into neighboring towns. The program's success began attracting national attention, with local leaders and educators traveling to study its model. David found himself inundated with requests to speak about the initiative's structure, while Eric worked tirelessly to ensure its core values remained intact. One day, Eric received an invitation to appear on a national talk show. The email subject line read, "Lena Crawford's Legacy, a story of justice and redemption." Eric hesitated. Speaking on such a public platform meant exposing not only Lena's story, but also the difficult truths about his father and the Henderson case. He reached out to David, whose response was swift and resolute. "We owe it to her. If we don't tell her story, someone else will, and they might not do it justice." The studio lights were brighter than Eric had anticipated. As he adjusted his microphone, the host, a charismatic journalist named Julia Tate, offered him a reassuring smile. "Relax," she said. "We're here to honor a remarkable woman, not interrogate you." The interview began with a recap of Lena's life and her sacrifices. Photos of her teaching and her work with underprivileged families appeared on the screen behind them, eliciting murmurs of admiration from the live audience. "What made Lena Crawford so extraordinary?" Julia asked, leaning forward. Eric thought carefully before responding. "She had an unwavering commitment to truth and justice, even when it came at great personal cost. She believed in the power of education and second chances, and she never stopped fighting for what was right." Julia nodded. "Your father, Judge Samuel Vance, played a significant role in this story. How has your family come to terms with his decisions during the Henderson case?" Eric felt the weight of the question. "It hasn't been easy. My father's choices were driven by a desire to protect the town, but they also caused harm. What I admire most is his willingness to confront his past and use his mistakes to teach others." The audience applauded, their support palpable. "And what about you?" Julia asked. "How has Lena's story changed your life?" Eric smiled, thinking of the many moments he'd shared with Lena in her final days. "She taught me that true justice isn't about punishment. It's about understanding, empathy, and doing what's right, even when it's difficult. That lesson has shaped how I approach my work as a police officer and as a mentor." The interview concluded with a standing ovation. As Eric left the stage, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Lena's story was reaching more people than ever, inspiring change on a scale he hadn't imagined. Back at the precinct, Eric noticed a shift in his colleagues. The precinct's community outreach program was thriving, with officers actively participating in mentorship sessions and restorative justice workshops. Captain Reed even proposed integrating these principles into standard police training. One afternoon, Eric found a letter on his desk. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the content stopped him in his tracks. "Officer Vance, I wanted to thank you for the kindness you showed my son, Marcus. He's doing well now, working part-time and going to school. You gave him a second chance when no one else would, and I'll never forget that. Sincerely, Claire Thompson." Eric folded the letter carefully, placing it in his desk drawer. It was a small reminder of the impact Lena's legacy continued to have. Meanwhile, Samuel began working on a memoir, detailing his experiences and the lessons he had learned. It was a cathartic process, forcing him to confront the guilt and regret he had carried for decades. He often consulted Eric and David, ensuring that Lena's story was represented faithfully. One evening, Samuel called Eric over to his home. "I want you to read something," Samuel said, handing him a draft of the book's final chapter. Eric sat in the familiar leather armchair, the pages trembling slightly in his hands. Samuel watched him closely as he read. "The choices I made during the Henderson case were meant to protect the many, but they came at a cost I will never fully repay. Lena Crawford's courage showed me the true meaning of justice. She held a mirror to my actions, forcing me to see the cracks in my moral compass. Her story is one of resilience and integrity, and it is my hope that sharing it will inspire others to choose the harder, better path." When Eric finished, he looked up at his father. "It's powerful, Dad. Lena would be proud." Samuel nodded, his expression softening. "I hope so." The memoir was published the following year, receiving critical acclaim. Titled Reflections of a Judge, Truth, Justice, and Redemption, it became a bestseller, sparking widespread discussions about ethics in leadership and the importance of second chances. At the book's launch event, Eric spoke to a packed auditorium. "This isn't just my father's story or Lena's story. It's a reminder that our choices, big or small, have consequences, but it's never too late to make things right." The foundation flourished in the years that followed, expanding its programs and helping countless families. Sarah Chen, the first scholarship recipient, became a vocal advocate for education reform, often citing Lena as her inspiration. David continued to dedicate his legal expertise to underserved communities, while Eric rose through the ranks at the precinct, balancing his duties with his commitment to the Lena Initiative. As Eric reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Lena's light had not only illuminated his path, but also the paths of so many others. Her story, once hidden, had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of truth, justice, and the courage to stand for what is right. The years rolled on, but the memory of Lena Crawford remained a cornerstone of the Vance family's journey. Her influence rippled outward, touching lives in ways even she might not have imagined. The foundation, now rebranded as the Crawford-Vance Initiative for Justice and Education, had become a national movement. Its programs included scholarships, mentorships, and restorative justice initiatives that reached into schools, community centers, and even correctional facilities. Eric found himself busier than ever, balancing his growing responsibilities at the precinct with his role as a public advocate for the initiative. Each day presented new challenges, but Lena's words, her steady belief in the power of truth and kindness, guided him. One crisp autumn morning, Eric received an unexpected visitor at the precinct, a young man in a neatly pressed suit carrying a briefcase. "Officer Vance?" the man asked, his voice formal yet warm. "Yes, that's me," Eric replied, motioning for the man to sit across from his desk. "My name is Alex Henderson," the man said, extending his hand. Eric's breath caught. He had not heard the Henderson name mentioned in years. Despite the family's once dominant presence in the town, their legacy had been reduced to a cautionary tale of unchecked power and moral compromise. "I came here," Alex continued, "because I've been reading your father's memoir and Lena Crawford's story. It's made me reflect on my family's role in all of it and my own place in the world." Eric leaned back in his chair, studying Alex carefully. The young man's sincerity was apparent, but his connection to the Hendersons cast a shadow of uncertainty. "What exactly are you looking for, Mr. Henderson?" Alex hesitated, then opened his briefcase and produced a folder. Inside were documents, handwritten letters, and what appeared to be a personal journal. "These belong to my grandfather," Alex said. "He was one of the architects of the decisions that defined our family's legacy. Reading them, I realized how much harm we caused, not just to the town, but to individuals like Lena Crawford." Eric flipped through the pages, his heart pounding as he saw familiar names and events. The journal detailed behind-the-scenes deals, threats, and manipulations that aligned with what Lena and Samuel had uncovered years before. "I want to make amends," Alex said, his voice steady. "I know I can't undo the past, but I believe there's a way to make things right." The Henderson Trust Fund, once a symbol of the family's ill-gotten wealth, was dismantled under Alex's guidance. In its place, he created the Henderson Crawford Fellowship, dedicated to supporting underserved communities through education and social justice initiatives. At the announcement event, Alex stood alongside Eric, David, and Sarah, addressing a crowd that included local officials, former students of Lena's, and many who had been directly affected by the Hendersons' actions. "We cannot change what was done," Alex said, his voice firm but emotional. "But we can choose to honor those who fought for justice, even when it cost them everything. This fellowship is my family's commitment to a better future." Eric watched as the crowd erupted in applause, a mix of hope and forgiveness sweeping through the room. Lena's vision, once confined to the pages of her journal, had grown into a movement that transcended generations. In the years that followed, Eric and Alex became unlikely allies. Together, they traveled to schools and conferences, sharing their intertwined stories as a testament to the power of redemption and the enduring importance of ethical choices. Samuel, now retired, found solace in mentoring young judges, emphasizing the lessons he had learned from his own failures. David continued to expand the initiative's legal advocacy branch, working tirelessly to ensure that the vulnerable and marginalized had access to justice. And through it all, Lena's words remained a guiding light. "Every choice we make sends ripples through the lives of others. Let those ripples carry hope, truth, and kindness." One quiet evening, Eric returned to Lena's grave, as he often did. The wildflowers he had planted were thriving, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the somber granite. Kneeling, he traced her name with his fingers, a soft smile playing on his lips. "We're doing it, Lena," he whispered. "We're keeping your promise." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the cemetery, Eric felt a profound sense of peace. Lena's legacy was no longer just a memory. It was a living force, changing the world one small act at a time. Eric lingered at Lena's grave, the wildflowers swaying gently in the cool evening breeze. He could still feel the weight of her journal in his hands, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of her quiet resolve. The soft rustle of leaves overhead seemed almost like her voice, urging him forward even now. "You always said the truth has its own power," Eric murmured, his voice breaking the stillness. "You were right, Lena. You were right." He stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. Though the cemetery was quiet, he could hear echoes of the bustling world Lena had left behind, a world she had irrevocably changed. Her legacy wasn't just in the scholarships or foundations. It was in the countless lives she had touched, the decisions her story had inspired. And Eric knew there was still more to do. Back at the precinct, Eric's desk was piled high with paperwork. The community outreach initiative had grown beyond his expectations, and the work to ensure its success often consumed his evenings. Yet tonight, he couldn't bring himself to focus on logistics. Instead, he opened Lena's journal. Flipping through its pages as though seeking her guidance, he landed on an entry dated decades ago, written in her neat, deliberate script. "Today, I spoke to a student who felt invisible. He told me he didn't think he mattered, that the world had already decided his worth. I told him that the world doesn't get the final say. We do. Every time we make a choice, we declare our value. And when we choose kindness, we remind others of theirs." Eric read the passage twice, his chest tightening. He closed the journal and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had always thought of Lena as someone who fought against overwhelming odds, but in moments like this, she seemed more like a quiet guide, offering simple truths to a world desperate for clarity. The following morning, Eric met with Captain Reed in his office. The captain had been an unexpected supporter of the initiative, his initial skepticism melting into admiration as he witnessed its impact. "Morning, Vance," Reed said, motioning for him to sit. "Got an interesting call this morning. A councilwoman wants to talk about expanding the program citywide." Eric raised his eyebrows. "Citywide? That's ambitious." "It's the right time," Reed said, leaning back in his chair. "What you've built here isn't just making a difference, it's changing how we think about policing. The city's noticing. Hell, I'm noticing." Eric nodded slowly. The idea was daunting, but it felt right. Lena's work had always been about reaching as many people as possible, about ensuring that no one fell through the cracks. Expanding the initiative wasn't just a next step, it was a continuation of her dream. In the weeks that followed, Eric and a small team began drafting plans for the citywide rollout. They worked late into the night, meeting with community leaders, educators, and even former police critics. Each conversation reinforced the importance of what they were building, a bridge between law enforcement and the communities they served. One evening, as Eric was reviewing proposals in the precinct's community outreach office, a knock on the door startled him. He looked up to see Alex Henderson standing in the doorway, holding a thick folder. "Mind if I join you?" Alex asked. "Not at all," Eric said, motioning to an empty chair. Alex sat down and placed the folder on the table. "I've been researching ways to fund the expansion," he said. "There's an old Henderson family property we could sell. The proceeds would cover a significant portion." Eric blinked in surprise. "That's generous." "It's necessary," Alex replied. "My family built its fortune on the backs of people who didn't have a voice. It's time we gave that voice back." For the next hour, the two men pored over numbers and strategies, their unlikely partnership growing stronger with each shared idea. By the time they finished, Eric couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for Alex's courage to confront his family's past, for Lena's unwavering belief in redemption, and for the quiet ripple effects that had brought them all together. The citywide launch of the Crawford Vance initiative was marked by a ceremony in the downtown square. Hundreds of people gathered, their faces a mix of hope and determination. A large banner hung above the stage, bearing Lena's favorite quote, "Every brave action sets off waves we might never see." Eric stepped up to the podium, his heart pounding as he looked out at the crowd. Among them, he saw familiar faces: his father, Samuel, now mentoring young judges; his brother David, standing beside scholarship recipients with a quiet pride in his eyes; Alex, seated near the front, his expression resolute. "Thank you all for being here," Eric began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "This initiative is more than a program. It's a promise to listen, to learn, and to act with compassion. It's about honoring the truth no matter how difficult and using it to build a better future." He paused, scanning the crowd. None of this would have been possible without the courage of one woman. Lena Crawford taught us that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Her story reminds us that even the smallest acts of kindness can change lives. The applause was thunderous, echoing through the square as the crowd rose to their feet. Eric stepped back, letting the moment wash over him. Somewhere in the noise, he felt Lena's presence, a quiet affirmation that they were on the right path. That evening, as the city lights twinkled against the dark sky, Eric returned to his apartment. He placed Lena's journal on his desk, its pages now accompanied by a framed photo of her smiling warmly. With a deep breath, he opened a new notebook and began to write. "Today, we launched something extraordinary. It's only the beginning, but I can feel the momentum. Lena was right. Every choice we make sends ripples through the lives of others. I hope these ripples carry her wisdom, her kindness, and her unshakable belief in the power of truth." The pen moved steadily across the page, the words a testament to a legacy that would never fade. Eric closed the notebook and set it aside, a satisfied yet contemplative expression settling on his face. The room was quiet, illuminated only by the soft glow of his desk lamp. Outside, the hum of the city carried on. But inside, Eric was grounded by the weight of his reflections. Lena's voice, her principles, her unwavering resolve, they weren't just memories. They were guiding forces shaping his every decision. In the weeks following the initiative's citywide launch, the program's influence grew exponentially. Reports flooded in from precincts across the city: lower crime rates in troubled neighborhoods, increased community engagement, and a noticeable shift in how officers approached their duties. One precinct captain remarked, "This isn't just policing, it's building relationships. We're not just showing up after things go wrong, we're helping prevent them in the first place." Eric spent much of his time traveling between these precincts, meeting with officers, community leaders, and the program's beneficiaries. Every interaction reaffirmed what Lena had taught him. Change starts with understanding, and understanding starts with listening.